Health and Environmental Affairs Committee. Our first bit of business today is to have a
excuse me.
Sorry about that technical interruption. As I was saying, this is the EHE Committee. We'll begin today by having a briefing on the new budget presented by the governor a week and a half ago. So I welcome our committee. I welcome the staff of Legislative Services, as well as the public. With that, I believe, do I pass it on to you, Mr. Romans?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for joining us, Mr. Romans.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we're going to share with you kind of a brief overview of the governor's budget proposal. I think it's going to be shared on the screen in a second here. So, I mean, in a really high level, 10,000-foot big picture, the state is in an extraordinarily good financial position coming into this session. Before the governor submitted his budget, we were looking at a surplus in the current year of about $4 billion in state general funds. And so that allowed the governor to do three things in the budget that you don't often see altogether in a single budget. Reduce taxes, sock away billions of dollars in reserves, and make a number of spending enhancements. So we'll kind of go through the highlights today. So the chart at the top of the page you're looking at shows you the overall budget growth for the current year, 2022, and the upcoming year, 2023. The governor's proposing about $58 billion total for fiscal 23. It's actually a decrease of $3.6 billion, or about 6%. The reason for that, though, is that we had an extraordinary level of federal funding in the current year because of all the various federal stimulus money that came into the state. And so that money is going to begin dissipating in fiscal 23, and federal funds drop almost $8 billion, or about 30%. The state general fund dollars, the second line in that chart, is really the notable number, with it growing 4.6 billion, or 22%. Now, within that 4.6 billion of growth, the governor is putting 2.4 billion into the rainy day fund. So he's appropriating money to a savings account, essentially. So if you back that out of the calculation, the budget grows still over $2 billion, about 13%. So there is quite a bit of additional spending given the substantial surpluses the state has. Note that appropriation to the rainy day fund will bring the balance in the rainy day fund to $3.6 billion, which is 16% of general fund revenues. So it's an extraordinary savings level. I mean, as far as we can tell, there's never been anything approaching that level of money in the rainy day fund at the end of a fiscal year. In addition to that, the governor left nearly $600 million in the general fund at the end of fiscal 23, so about $4.2 billion of cash set aside for the future. Let's go to the next slide. So one of the key elements of the governor's proposal is tax relief, and the three components of that are shown in the chart there in the middle of this page. And we show you the revenue loss in fiscal 23, and then in the final year, his forecast, fiscal 27. So the first piece is phasing out income tax for retirees. The value, he does it slowly across fiscal 23 through fiscal 28. First year revenue loss is about 188 million. By fiscal 27, it's 730 million. We have not done our own fiscal note. These are the governor's estimates, and our own note will be out later in session, and we'll probably extend through 28 so we can see what, when fully phased in, what the revenue loss is. The second piece is business filing fees. There's legislation in that would exempt people who file online from paying the business filing fee. For most people, that's a $300 fee each year. So the revenue loss from that proposal is estimated by the governor at 36 million for fiscal 23, growing to about 48 million in fiscal 27. Obviously, the precise amount will depend on how many people take advantage of online filing. And then the final piece is to extend something you did last year in the Relief Act. You provided some enhancements to the earned income tax credit for calendar tax years 2020 through 2022 with some relief from the impact of the pandemic. The governor is proposing to make those permanent. Since they were already in effect for fiscal 23, there's no fiscal impact in 23, but in subsequent years, it will cost the state about 160 million annually in revenue.
David, I hate to interrupt you. In terms of the chart in the middle, 23 and 27, is a 27 figure what that will cost or the cumulative amount in 27?
It's just the fiscal 27 cost, not the cumulative amount.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So those are the three pieces of the tax proposal. Let's go to the next slide. So, one of the bigger questions is, well, is this all affordable? And there's sort of two viewpoints on this that are shown in this chart. So let's start with that solid black line. That is the structural budget surplus that the governor is projecting in his accounting. And when I say structural budget, just meaning ongoing revenues exceed ongoing spending in these years. So before his tax relief plan, the governor showed a large structural surplus. And then the blue bars below show you after you lose the revenue under his tax plan that he still believes we would be structurally balanced throughout the forecast period. DLS differs a little bit, and the gray bars show you that in 26 and 27 from the governor's forecast. And the primary reason that you see a big gap in fiscal 27 is that we think that the governor's forecast understates the demands from K-12 education under the current law with phasing in Kerwin and all the education aid formulas. And we think it understates it by quite a bit by fiscal 27. So in our view, we would be out of structural balance by about $400 million in fiscal 27. And that gap would probably get a bit worse in fiscal 28 for two reasons. The first, that retirement income tax proposal isn't fully phased in until 28, so there'll be even more revenue losses at 28. And secondly, because the costs of implementing Kerwin will continue to climb in fiscal 28, and the Blueprint Fund will not have enough money to cover all those costs, so a larger general fund subsidy would be needed in fiscal 28. All right, let's go on to the next slide. So just I mentioned at the start of the briefing that we entered the session for the current year with about a $4 billion cash balance. And so we try here to show you, well, what did the governor do with that one-time cash surplus? And 2.4 goes to the rainy day fund, 2.4 billion. About 315 million ends up in the general fund. So 2.7 of the 4 billion being put into savings. There's a number of small operating budget adjustments in fiscal 22, totaling about 229 million. The biggest component of that is raises that went into effect for state employees, as well as some bonuses. They went into effect this month. There's about 91 million of one-time spending in fiscal 23 on various operating costs. And then the big expenditure is the governor's put 910 million toward pay-go capital, so spending cash to support capital projects in fiscal 23. So that's where the one-time money went. Now, at the bottom of page 4, we get into some bullet points on the big highlights of what is in the budget. In the area of K-12 education, overall education aid grows by 260 million, about 3.5%. It is notable that no funding was provided for the education effort adjustment part of the Kerwin formula. The legislature believes is a mandate. As a result, Baltimore City will receive about 99 million less than they would have if that was funded, and Prince George's County would receive about 26.5 million less than it would have if that was funded. In the healthcare area, there are a number of mandates for provider rate increases. The governor has funded them all. They will provide significant rate increases for DDA providers, behavioral health providers, and many of the providers who work in the Medicaid program, including nursing homes and a lot of the home and community-based service waiver providers. Also money to increase rates for physicians and for dentists in the Medicaid program. There's about 100 million of initiatives in the crime prevention and victim services arena. The largest amount there is about 48 million being added to the police aid formula, sort of a discretionary decision by the governor. And that benefits every jurisdiction in the state, including Baltimore City, which would get about $8 million from that. The city does not normally receive money through the existing police aid formula. And there's about 23 million within that 100 million for victim service providers, as the federal funding supporting those programs has been dropping. In childcare, there's $50 million being added to the current year's budget as a deficiency to provide stabilization grants to the childcare providers. This is on top of hundreds of millions of dollars that have gone out from the federal stimulus for stabilization grants for the providers. And then the governor is proposing to expand funding for the childcare scholarship program, which helps subsidize childcare for lower income families in fiscal 23, putting about 10 million aside for that purpose. The last thing there on page 4 is cybersecurity. The governor proposed of 110 million of money for cybersecurity within state government. Let's go on to page 5. A couple other things I just wanted to highlight. Higher education receives quite a bit of additional money in this budget. The University System of Maryland gets a 19% increase, almost $300 million. Incorporated within that is money for salary increases, just like other state employees are getting. That's about 40% of the funding that they're receiving. Similarly, Morgan State University is getting a substantial increase, about 28% or $33 million. Community colleges and the non-public higher education institutions that receive funding through Sellinger also get big growth, and that's because their formulas run off of the aid per student at the public 4 years. So the community college formula grows 59 million or 19%. The Sellinger formula grows by about 30 million or 34%. As I've alluded to, state employees are getting raises this month, and then they will get additional salary increases in fiscal 23. The governor put a total of 832 million in the budget across the 2 years to pay for those increases. One note on the capital budget. The governor has set aside 50 million for legislative bond initiatives. In recent years, he didn't always set money aside for that. So there is money already sort of earmarked for for the Senate and the House to allocate for those projects. At the bottom of page 5, we just get into some kind of potential issues for the session in the fiscal world. The first, obviously, is working through the tax relief proposals and acting on those. The second is trying to determine what the right balance between spending and savings is. Does the General Assembly really want 16% in the rainy day fund? And then if it does, should there be some criteria in statute about when that money gets utilized? Because right now there's really no rules about spending money out of the rainy day fund. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Then this chart on the next page shows you, obviously, one of the issues is the blueprint fund. So the education effort adjustment I already talked about, and trying to resolve that issue. And then there are some other non-mandated items from the blueprint that the governor also did not fund, and they're delineated in that chart there. They add up to about $14 million, training for leaders and teachers, expert review teams, model curriculum, instructional materials, and so forth. Again, the governor chose not to fund any of those. A couple of other issues. As you know, Congress passed an infrastructure bill a few months back. None of the money from the infrastructure bill is in the state budget yet. Overall, Maryland's going to get about $8 billion over 5 years. About $3 billion of that is truly new money. A lot of the $8 billion is the reauthorization of existing funding streams for transportation. But overall, we still get about $3 billion of truly new money over the 5 years. So I think the budget committees will be engaging with the various agencies about what their plans are for that money. And then the long-term sustainability of the Blueprint Fund. By our estimates, looking at the governor's budget, we think the Blueprint Fund would exhaust its surplus in fiscal 27, and it would start needing to be a general fund supplement to the ongoing revenues going into the Blueprint Fund, and that supplement will get larger in future years. So considering whether you want to put additional money into the Blueprint Fund to shore it up for the future. One final issue I would just mention is state employment has been suffering during the pandemic, and with the challenges that all employers are having with hiring. Overall, more than 10% of state positions are currently vacant. almost every large state agency is above 10%. It used to be there were a few agencies that had specific challenges, but now it's pretty much all of the agencies. And clearly the governor has tried to address that with the substantial salary increases proposed. But again, I think certainly the budget committees will be looking more closely at what else the state could do to try to be competitive in the current hiring environment. There's two other charts I want to show you. I'm going to jump ahead quite a few pages to page 25. Just wanted to give you a little bit more on K-12 education, given your interest in that area. So what this chart does is it breaks out by county three components. The first is that education effort index, which was not funded. It shows you the dollar amounts for the two jurisdictions that are impacted. But there are also two areas in the budget where the governor put more money in than was mandated. The first is for compensatory education. Compensatory education enrollments are down. That's the free and reduced price meal students. They're down quite a bit during the pandemic. And so the governor held all the jurisdictions harmless who had decreases. That costs about $57 million, and you can see the allocation there. The other is that the current legislation for full-day kindergarten required the funding be provided to support families up to 300% of the federal poverty level. There's not readily available information on that. So the governor just used all children as the calculation rather than up to 300%, which results in some overfunding for that program above the mandate of about 68 million. And you can see the allocation of that in the chart. So the net result is basically a wash. You underfunded some of the one mandated program, overfunded some of the others. But while it's a wash statewide, as you can see, it has different impacts jurisdictionally. Mr. Chairman, those are sort of the high-level remarks I wanted to share. I'm happy to try to answer any questions the committee has.
Thank you, Mr. Romans. We'll entertain questions. Let me ask just another question. Is that document, the 25 or 28 page document, available in hard copy?
Yes, we can certainly share that with your staff and they can distribute it.
Yes, I know usually we have it in front of us and we leaf through it. So I sometimes like to, just like with a newspaper, I like to read it in hands rather than online. So if we can either get one copy and we'll duplicate, or if DLS wants to get a print shop and get us 11 plus copies, that would be great. Okay, I've got some questions, but I'll defer to the end. Committee, if you have questions, now's the time. Senator Ellis, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Romans. So a couple questions. One is really quick. I met with the comptroller a few weeks ago, and he mentioned an amount in the budget surplus in the $6 billion range, and the number you used today was in the $4 billion range. Why is there that discrepancy?
I've been asked that question before. I cannot tell you where the comptroller got his number from.
Okay. Okay. So I'd rather trust your number. Is that an accurate?
Our numbers are consistent with the Department of Budget and Management's, numbers. So I think we're all on the same page.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I'm also concerned with the that funding for, I guess, Prince George's and Baltimore City. Why is that those billions not in the budget, and what effect will that have on the entire Kerwin in those jurisdictions?
So the administration's point of view on that issue, the reason they didn't fund it is they say that for fiscal 23 only, they do not believe it to be a mandate. So they chose not to fund it. The legislative point of view, I think, has been, certainly was intended when it was passed, that it is a mandate. We have asked the Attorney General's office to opine on whether or not it is a mandate, and they are actively engaged in that right now. So hopefully in the next couple of weeks, we will have some advice from them. To the second part of your question, so what it means for Baltimore City and Prince George's County is that the local governments still have to make the local maintenance of effort payments. So the school systems will end up with the amount of money that they were expected to get, but it means the city would have to put in more 99 million more than they would have otherwise had to put in. And Prince George's County would have to put in 26.5 million more of its own money than it would otherwise have had to put in.
Yeah, so the problem could be in the way the current bill was blueprint bill was written to create that ambiguity with whether it's a mandate or not.
It could be. I think I'm fairly optimistic that there's going to be a view from the Attorney General's office that it is in fact a mandate, but we shall see what they actually say.
Great. Thank you, sir.
Senator Cruz, I'm going to call on you next, but before we leave that topic, David, besides the 126 million in the educational adjustment, there's another $14 million, as you pointed out on one of the pages,
Yep.
and which also went unfunded. Does that fall under also that administration's position? It's not a mandate, and will that be addressed by the AG as well?
The view, I think everyone agrees that it is not technically a mandate for that 14 million. And the administration's view is that they were not going to fund the things that were not mandated. So they chose not to, and the AG would not be opining on, as I think they've already said, that the way it was drafted is not a mandate for those 14 million of items.
So that 14 million, which was fairly significant programs put into the blueprint, is it the point that they're not required to be funded any year? I mean,
That is correct. And so I think
some go beyond 1 year.
Right. They're not required to be funded in any year. So that is something that if you're concerned about it, the committee may want to rectify in legislation to make it clear that those are mandated in the future years.
Okay, so the 14 million on that chart later in the document is
Correct.
not funded, and the interpretation is it's not mandated.
Correct.
Okay. I have other questions, but let me go back to Senator Carrozza, followed by Senator Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Chair, for requesting the document. I think some of us who've been on the Budget Committee, we're used to kind of going through it. So I'm going back to one of the points I was trying to take notes on the areas where the governor increased the education budget. There were a couple areas, and I was just trying to make sure I had my numbers right and where that was going. If you could just flush that out, please.
Yeah, I don't know if we can share the screen again, just so the numbers are in front of the senators. But yeah, so the two areas where there's sort of extra money is compensatory education. Not sure why that's getting shared.
Yeah, I think you want to get out of that
The
screen.
wrong screen.
That's on my screen. So, and Maureen, you're sharing your Teams. All right, so I'll talk while we'll get that fixed. So there are the two parts: the compensatory education program. The enrollment is down because people didn't submit the documentation on free and reduced price meals this past year, because pretty much all the children were able under federal law to get meals. And we're on page 25. And so that holding everybody harmless for that enrollment decline cost the state about $57 million in fiscal 23. And the chart shows you by county what those amounts are. The other piece is full day kindergarten. The governor's included more money than was required to. He only had to put in money per student up to students who are up to 300% of the poverty level. That data wasn't easily available in their view, and they just funded it for every student. So everybody, every child, not just those who are at 300% or below. And so that higher threshold, including everybody, provides additional money to each jurisdiction based on the number of children of the appropriate age. And that adds up to the 68 million. I actually meant, just while we're here, if we can just go to the next slide. I forgot to show you this, but this might be interesting to you all. So these are the K-12 enrollment trends. On the left-hand side is the full-time equivalent students for fiscal that were used to run the formulas for fiscal 21 through 23. So like the 23 numbers reflect enrollment this past September of 2001. And what's interesting is you can see enrollment, went down last year, which wasn't surprising in fiscal 22 with the pandemic, but it did not come back in fiscal 23. We're still well below the fiscal 21 level. In fact, about 25,000 fewer students in the public schools than 2 years ago. And you can see that it's pretty uniform across the state, although there are some higher percentages in a few jurisdictions, and there's a couple of jurisdictions that really didn't see too much impact. And then on the right-hand side of the chart, we show you the same information, but just those numbers for free and reduced price meals. And here you can see why the governor stepped in with the hold harmless. You can see in jurisdictions like Montgomery and Prince George's and St. Mary's, over 20% reductions in the student counts. I don't think anyone thinks there's that big of a reduction in students who are eligible for free and reduced price meals. The documentation was not submitted by the parents. So anyway, that helps to explain the compensatory education issue and sort of generally what's going on with school enrollment. So hopefully that answers the senator's question.
Senator, can we move on? Let's go to Senator Washington, followed by Senator Frey-Hester.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this overview. I just want to dig into the compensatory just a little bit. It's an enhancement. So we have a base formula, and then we have factors to address certain challenges that individual jurisdictions might face. What is the compensatory education program meant to adjust for?
I'm hardly an expert in K-12, but it's driven by children who are lower income. So the number of free and reduced price meal eligible students for jurisdictions. So it's trying to address, in a sense, poverty or lower income.
Right. So if you go back to, you're saying, if you could go back to the next slide, you said that the allocations here are discretionary. In other words, the governor could choose how much to put into the compensatory education. Is that correct?
So he funded the mandated formulas appropriately, but then he added on top of that additional money because some of these school systems saw such substantial enrollment declines in their free and reduced price meal population.
Right.
So this is sort of extra on top of the required funding.
Right. But I think what this chart shows is that he picked winners and losers, and that one of the poorest, we have poorer jurisdictions. Certainly Allegheny should get the resources, Dorchester, some of our poorer jurisdictions. But one of the largest populations of my city, Baltimore City, and then also Prince George's County, that are majority African-American school systems with the greatest need, there was the discretion and the decision to not enhance the educational funding for those jurisdictions. But that's what I'm seeing, because he has that choice, correct?
Well, yes. So the Education Effort Index, which is separate from compensatory ed, yes, he chose not to fund that program, and it hits those two jurisdictions.
So chose not to fund the children of Baltimore City or the children of Prince George's County. The other thing I wanted to, and I'll follow up with, are just some details around some of the loan programs. And Chairman, I'll just send those questions directly. So we have some questions about the Department of Natural Resources, and in particular, there's a loan program called the Jane E. Loughton Conservation Loan Program, and it's been flat funded, right? Over the years, I guess at $2 million-ish. But in fiscal, and these loans are to help address some energy conservation, support nonprofits and businesses or local jurisdictions that want to improve energy efficiency. And I noticed in FY22, more than half of the money was set aside for state agencies. So for 6 months, it's set aside for state agencies. And then only after 3 months, 220,000 of this 2 million was set aside for qualifying nonprofits and entities. And then if there was anything left over after 9 months, then it could be given to nonprofits. So could you, I know it was set up originally to provide, very low interest loans to locals, to nonprofits and organizations that want to do energy efficiency in the name of this delegate, this wonderful Montgomery County District 18 delegate. And I was really surprised to see that more than half of the loans were set aside for state agencies. So if you could, do you know anything about that, or could you get us some information about that?
Yeah, I recall that's what you described, but I don't remember quite the details of why that came about. But yes, we can certainly look into that. And if there were other questions that you were referencing, I think if you just send them to the committee staff, they can forward it on to me and we can get you a response.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Senator Washington. Senator Fry Hester, I think I had you next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Romans, thank you for this presentation and for always being so approachable with questions about the budget. You always reply quickly and we appreciate that. My question is about funding for pre-K. And I know in Howard County, and I believe it's probably true across the state, there's been some concern about the pre-K grants not being large enough potentially to cover all the new preschools, both in terms of the operating costs and also the capital cost. Was that part of the $14 million that the governor cut or didn't fund in the blueprint? And then secondly, is there any way we can access money in the rainy day fund, or is that totally locked up?
So the 14 million that the governor did not fund wasn't specifically for pre-K. It was more sort of studies and training and sort of support things around a variety of K-12 issues. So not directly related to the pre-K. In terms of the rainy day fund, if the governor doesn't want to spend the money, there's no way for this year for the General Assembly to make him do it. You can cut the appropriation to the rainy day fund, but it would just then sit in the general fund. So it would require some sort of negotiation with the governor to try to get him to bring more of the money in through a supplemental budget later in session.
Thank you very much.
I have a couple questions for you, David. Do I get this right that the governor cut $99 million from Baltimore City for the educational adjustment that was in Kerwin, but yet added $100 million for crime prevention?
That is correct.
So in other words, rather than spend $100 million for children to get to grade level and get educational supports, the money shifted to the back end after potentially young people either drop out or lose interest, and in some case, unfortunately, resort to crime, and investing the money at the back end rather than the front end.
Not sure if that was a question, but I would just say the governor put more money.
I guess that falls
budget.
under, isn't that so?
Yeah, isn't that? But I mean, in general, I'd say he put more money into a lot of different places, and then he didn't fund the education effort index.
Okay, and I don't want to put you too far on the spot, but the last question I have is actually factual, and I think you said this at the front end of your presentation, that the tax cut, would implicitly or explicitly cut into the back years of Kerwin, because you said that Kerwin will be exhausted 2027, and the tax cut actually start to make significant, I think $700+ million in the very same year. And I think this gets back to one of your first screenshots on page somewhere 2 to 5, where you had the firm black line and then the dotted black line.
Yeah, page 3, if we want to put that up again. Yeah, so I mean, I think the
Okay, now we have the slide. So in other words, that dotted black line in 2027 reduce our budget toward the increased loss of revenue because of the proposed tax cuts correspond to our inability to fully fund Kerwin through its existence. Is that fair?
There's definitely an intersection, especially beginning in fiscal 27, between needing general funds to help supplement the blueprint fund to fund Kerwin. So, additional demands for general funds for K-12, and then the governor's tax proposal getting fully phased in. And the combination of those two is creating stress that we see creating a structural budget shortfall. So it would be challenging to do them both at the magnitude that it looks like they would need to be done.
So, and again, I don't want to belabor this, but the proposal to cut taxes, you used the word put stress or makes it problematic of our fully funding our commitment on the blueprint for Maryland's future in the out years.
Right, it's going to force something. I mean, if this all played out the way the governor's proposed, it definitely would create the need to cut things somewhere in the budget, whether it's Kerwin or cutting other things to make sure there's room for Kerwin, or having to reconsider, revenue options in the future.
Great. Okay. Senator Ellis, do you have another question, or you just didn't drop your hand from the screen?
I have another question, but I didn't drop my hand. So
okay. Well,
can I? Or
I'm sorry. How about you, Senator Washington? Do you have additional questions? Okay, no. Okay, two things. First of all, you should have received in your mailbox the fiscal budget overview, which my staff has downloaded, which I'd asked for earlier. So it should be in your inbox, which you can download and print yourself rather than DLS. Senator Ellis, let me go to Senator Simon-Air, and then I'll come back to you for the final question word.
Thank you.
Senator Simon-Air.
Thank you. Just a quick question. Thank you, David. You mentioned there was a $4 billion surplus, and I know we received a lot of money from the feds as a one-time infusion. So how much of that is a one-time money out of that $4 billion, and how much is ongoing revenues that we'll continue to have?
Right. So the $4 billion was truly one time. It was the kind of surplus extra revenues from 2 years ago and then from in the current year. In terms of ongoing, it's actually this chart that's still on the screen, that solid black line. I mean, under the governor's forecast with what he's proposed spending, you have a structural surplus in fiscal 23. So it's sort of an ongoing surplus before the tax cut of about 500 million. And that grows, up until fiscal 26 to about $1 billion. And then as the Kerwin costs start cutting into it in the subsequent years. But you have a substantial surplus throughout the period before the tax cut, which is why the governor was able to propose a tax cut.
Okay, so that $4 billion is the one-time money that's infused, and then we have 500, 700 that will continue to go on as a revenue structural increase.
Right.
Okay, just all right. Thank you.
Senator Ellis for the final question, then we're going to move on.
Yeah, really quick. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hey, David, I think I heard you said that we, as the MGA, cannot do anything about those areas that were cut in the, say, educational effort and compensatory education. Did I hear you correctly?
You don't have the ability until next year to add to the budget. So you can't fix it on your own. You need the governor to bring the money into the budget through a supplemental budget.
Okay, great. Thank you for that clarification.
Okay, Mr. Roman, thank you. Very helpful, very informative. I think it helps frame issues coming before us. With that, this closes this section, this briefing. The committee, you'll have to re-sign in on a different link, and those in the public following along will have to also go to the website and follow along for our hearings for the day, which will be a separate link. With that, we're adjourned on the briefing, and I will see you again in a